Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this special event, Reality Check, Making Non-Religious People Count, hosted by the American Atheists, Galveston Bay Oasis, the Humanists of Houston, Houston Atheists, Houston Oasis, and the Secular Student Alliance at the University of Houston. If you're joining us from one of those organizations, we're glad that you could join us this morning. If you're not, you're joining us from elsewhere in Houston, maybe some of our friends at the Fellowship of Free Thought in Dallas. We've got some friends from Wichita, Kansas, from Wichita Oasis here this morning. We're glad to have you as well. We have got an excellent program for you, and we're going to start it off in a special way as folks are still arriving here this morning. We are proud to bring you some music from a local Texas-based singer-songwriter whose thoughtful lyrics and moving melodies bring the heart to attention. Everybody, please welcome Sara Van Buskirk.
Thank you very much. Well, I fell in love with the pretty young girl. You just one smile and she wrecked my world. I can't help but hold her tight, even though she stalks in the middle of the night. Oh, Susan, we've been down before. Oh, Susan, I'm knocking at your door. Sweet Susie, what did you say in the middle of the night? Well, I fell in love with the silly young man. You just one touch him in the palm of his hand, and I can't help but hold him tight, even though he snores in the middle of the night. Oh, Susan, we've been down before. Oh, Susan, I'm knocking at your door. Sweet Susie, what did you say in the middle of the night? Oh, Susan, we've been down before. Oh, Susan, I'm knocking at your door. Sweet Susie, what did you say in the middle of the night? I keep some things to myself, but I share my bed with you. And I keep my heart for myself, but I share my bed with you. And I keep my hands to myself, but I share my bed with you. And I keep my thoughts to myself, but I share my bed with you. Ooh, 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 oh, 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 Thank y'all so much for having me. Y'all are my first audience that I can somewhat see. I just see you, Jesse, but in over 3 months. So really appreciate you all listening. My name is Sara Van Buskirk. This song is called Interpreting Clouds. Oh, good times are over so fast, and only a fool could think it would last. Well, I'm sorry, girl, but you have to go. And if you change your mind, just let me know. If I were a cloud, in the snow just over that bank. Well, I'm out of reach, but not out of touch. Hey, I guess you tried, just not enough. And it's a long way down if you don't watch your step. And it's a hard way to learn, you squander your lives. And it's a guarantee to lose if you never react. And keep pining for the past. You don't know the places I've been. Yeah, I picked myself up and I ain't going again. It's like one foot finally reaching that distance and more. Knowing that the next wave's just gonna knock you off. You ain't the only one who's just been through a crash. You can't get in if you're afraid to get smashed. So stop it, I can. It's just that I won't. And knowing you ain't up if you can't stay afloat. And it's a long way down if you don't watch your step. And it's a hard way to learn, you squander your lives. And it's a guarantee to lose if you never react. They keep pining for the past. Just pining for the They're just pining for the past.
Sara Van Buskirk, ladies and gentlemen, lots of jazz hands and applause. Sara, thank you so much for playing for us this morning.
Thank y'all for having me. Really appreciate it.
And I should mention, if you'd like to follow Sara on Facebook and keep up with her music, I posted the link both in the Zoom chat and also over on Facebook Live in the comments as well. So make sure to like her page and follow her. All right, guys, let's dive right into it. Our main presentation today, Reality Check, Making Non-Religious People Count. Alison Gill is American Atheists Vice President for Legal and Policy, where she manages the organization's federal and state advocacy for religious equality and litigation activities to protect the separation of religion and government. Alison is a nationally recognized expert on civil rights law and state advocacy. Prior to her work with American Atheists, Alison worked as a consultant to nonprofits focusing on advocacy strategy and systemic change, and as senior legislative counsel at the Human Rights Campaign, where she managed state-level advocacy on issues such as conversion therapy, bullying prevention, education discrimination, health and wellness, youth homelessness, and data collection. Please welcome Alison Gill.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I'll go ahead and share my screen at this stage. So just 1 second. Let's get that up and running here. Okay, how is that looking? Yeah, all right, I'm getting thumbs up, perfect. So, so we're here to talk about data today, and I know that's probably the most exciting subject to hear about all week, but we're going to talk about data and about the non-religious and atheist communities. And so we'll start by talking about our agenda. And so first we're going to talk about the need for data. What exists regarding non-religious people across our country in terms of data, and why we needed to do this project. Secondly, we'll talk about the US Secular Survey, which is a survey we did last year, and the recent results published in this new report. And then we'll talk about what's coming next. And lastly, my understanding was we're going to do some breakout groups, and then we'll do Q&A after that. So please, since it's going to be a while, write down your questions so we don't lose them. I'm sure we're going to have lots of amazing questions, but please just write them down. We want to get through it all and give you all a chance to speak, and together before we come up with questions. And also, Jesse and Sam are going to review anything you type in the chat and help us pull out interesting questions as we go along. So you can either write them down yourself, or you can add them to the chat, and hopefully we'll catch them that way. So let's get going. A question we get a lot is, why did we need to do this survey, this data collection on non-religious people? Well, frankly, we as a community of non-religious people across our country, we just lack data. We don't have enough data about, the people, the challenges they face in their daily lives. Things about, for example, do people face discrimination? Do they have, what sort of families are they raised in? Are there higher rates for certain types of disparities? We don't know any of that. I mean, we all have certain assumptions and anecdotes we bring to the table that we've heard about in our lives. We might know people, for example, that have been rejected by their family for being non-religious. We might know people that have faced bullying in school, but we don't actually have data across the entire community, or at least we didn't until we started this project. And that's why we really felt the need. Now, a lot of the federal government actually collects a lot of data all across the country on different populations. They do data collection around health, around education, around, for example, working and being employed, housing. These are all things that the government collects data on. Unfortunately, they don't collect data, they don't break it out demographically in terms of religious belief or lack thereof. So unlike other categories of people, for example, based on race or gender or sexual orientation or immigrant status, for example, they don't have breakdowns based on religious beliefs or non-religious beliefs. And this is something that, for example, the LGBTQ community has spent years and years trying to get into federal surveys so that they can have better data about their communities. And that's something I was very involved in when I worked more so for the LGBTQ movement, because it's really critical. And I'll talk about the uses of data in a moment. But we're not really in the same position in the non-religious movement. We're in a very different position. One, because there's actually a law passed in 1972 that forbids mandatory data collection on religion. For example, the census is not allowed to collect data based on religion because of this law, which really limits overall our capacity. And other federal surveys have basically followed suit, and they've sort of limited the amount of data that we're able to collect. There are a few federal surveys that collect data based on religion, but they are very few and far between. They're not big population surveys. So we lack widespread data about our community. Now, there are a few really great organizations that do their own data collection. For example, Pew Research Center and PRI, the Public Religion Research Institute, which are fantastic. But they do data more broadly across the entire population. So they look at, for example, people's religious beliefs all across. They see how that matches up with political beliefs, and they do some probing. But they don't do like in-depth surveys about issues that specifically relate to non-religious people. This is my webinar cat, Anna. She insists on being in every webinar, regardless of what's going on. So regardless, so they don't have the sort of focused data collection about our communities that we want to see. And that's why we really felt the need to move forward with our own data collection that focuses much more so on non-religious communities. So it's not a population-based survey, it's one focused on non-religious communities. And so, why is data collection important? Well, without data, our communities are invisible to national discourse. We need data. I mean, data is used to help define what we talk about as a nation and what we understand problems are, and understand, like, for example, where there are disparities all across our nation. If we don't have data about our community, it's hard for us to sort of talk about the community in a way that lawmakers and advocates and the media can understand. And so we really need it. And I mentioned before, we have anecdotes, but without data, we don't really fully understand our community's needs because we don't have something that's across the entire board. We just have assumptions without real data about the community. It's also really helpful for advocacy, and I'll go into detail on that in a moment. But just as a shorthand, if I'm going into, as a lobbyist, if I'm going into a lawmaker's office and I'm talking about this problem we want them to address, I often ask, well, how many people does this affect? How does it affect them? Is it something that they're at higher rates for? They're at higher rates for homelessness or those types of issues. And if I can't address those, then it puts us overall in a weaker position when we want to do advocacy with these lawmakers. So data is really important for that purpose. Improving our services. Let me give you an example. We know from the data, which I'll be showing you, that as you can see what I've done a lot of data collection on LGBT issues, so I sort of defaulted there, that non-religious young people are at higher rates for things like bullying and harassment, right? So, but they're not currently built into anti-bullying programs in the same way as potentially other groups are. And so something we could do now that we know about this more so is to say, okay, anti-bullying programs, we have data showing that there are higher rates of harassment in school, very high rates. And we need you to please adapt these services to make sure that we're covering these populations which are facing these disparities in these areas more comprehensively. And that's just one example, but it sort of helps you understand what we're talking about there. And lastly, seeking grants and funding. Overall, as a non-religious sort of movement across the board, we don't have much in the way of foundation funding nor government funding. And they often provide funding when you have to show disparities and sort of gaps in order to show why you need funding to address those issues. And without comprehensive data across the board, it's very difficult to do that. So our hope is that by showing where there are these gaps, we'll be better able as a movement and all the different organizations to figure out where we need to and where we can apply for funding for various different programs. So that's an overview, but it sort of shows you why data is so important and why its lack in our community has had a really significant impact over its development since the beginning of the movement. So let me give you an example recently. So earlier this year, the administration released these proposed rules in 9 different agencies that would have potentially will get rid of religious freedom protections when the government provides funding to religious providers for government funded services, like, for example, homeless services or after school services or help with new first-time buyers of mortgages across the board. It's the vast majority of government programs. We're talking about hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars every year, go out from the federal government to grantees who then take that money and offer government-funded services. A lot of them are faith-based programs. And so there's restrictions in place that they can't, for example, take government money and then not provide services to people of different religions or of no religion. Or discriminate against people while providing services. And also they're supposed to allow people to opt out if a beneficiary does not want to receive services from, for example, a religious organization. So if you, as an atheist, for example, don't want to receive a service from Catholic charitable services, you'd prefer to go somewhere else, they're supposed to refer you. And that's a protection that's currently in regulations. Well, the administration is proposing to get rid of that. And we think that's terrible. We think people should have those religious freedom protections. But without data, with data now, we can show that people that are non-religious actually face higher rates of discrimination while going to get those services, particularly in more religious areas. So we can show why it's important that we keep these protections in the law and in regulations, because otherwise people that are supposed to be receiving these services may face higher rates of discrimination. And that's a really big deal for us to be able to show. And you can see how data directly leads to better advocacy on our behalf before the federal government. Does that make sense? So that's just one example, but there's many, many others. That's one from this year. So one thing I need to clarify is, there's this assumption. There's been a lot of research by Pew and PRI, for example, that talks about the nuns or religiously unaffiliated people, which now make up about a quarter of the population. They've recently surpassed all other single sort of religious groups, such as Catholics and evangelicals, to make up the largest percent as a population. However, this is a very disparate group. They're not all united. They have a wide range of different beliefs. And many of them, although they're framed as nuns or religiously unaffiliated people, are actually fairly religious. And so when we're talking about this data collection, we're not talking about this broad category of the nuns. We're talking about people that actively identify as atheist, agnostic, or one or more non-religious labels. So you can see this is research from Pew Research Center. You can see in 2018 through 19, religiously unaffiliated people made up about 26% of the population. But if you look at the other chart, if you look at exactly atheist and agnostic people, so a subset of that larger population, they make up closer to 9% of the population. So it's a much smaller group that we're talking about. And in the survey, we actually asked people, surveyed people who identified with one or more non-religious labels. So that's how we segmented people out. Because if you look at this broader category of nuns, we find out that about 34% of them claim that religion is somewhat or very important in their life. So that's about a third of the 26% that actively say religion is somewhat or very important to me. And about 61% believe in some sort of God or universal spirit. Well, that's not the same as being, an atheist. That's a little bit different. And so, although they're characterized together, we think that they're definitely separate enough that we want to collect data on people that are actively sort of non-religious or have one of these non-religious labels, which I'll talk about in a couple minutes. Okay, so with that, let's talk about the US Secular Survey and the new report that we have. So the US Secular Survey was conducted last year from October to November. It was a convenience sample, which means it's not a survey of a representative sample of population. Instead, we reached out through our networks, through email. The survey was available online. We made it available to as many different partners as possible so that they could help distribute it. We asked local groups all across the country to distribute it as well. When people took the survey, we asked them to send it to their friends, post it on places like Facebook and Twitter. Really we went on numerous different secular podcasts to get it word out, tried to get it out through all these different channels. So it was not just American Atheist networks, but we went far beyond that. And we definitely succeeded in that front. When we asked people if they're affiliated with national organizations like, for example, American Atheists, only 1 in 10 said that they were. So only 1 in 10 had membership in American Atheists. It was slightly higher for Freedom from Religion Foundation. But so that's one question I get a lot. Well, is this just a survey of American Atheist membership? The answer is certainly not. We've reached much, much further than that. It's a survey of people, it's a convenience sample, so it's not representative of non-religious people across the country, but we ended up with about 34,000 people that took the survey. Now, we had originally hoped to get between 5,000 and 10,000 people take the survey, and we actually surpassed 10,000 within the first 8 hours, which shows you a level of interest of people in this research and how much people really want to have an opportunity to tell their stories. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment, but that's an incredible response. And we actually had to cut the survey period a bit short. We had hoped to keep it open for a full month, but you actually have to pay per response. I don't know if people know that. So eventually, when we had exceeded it by that much, we're like, we've done some emergency fundraisers. We're gonna have to call it good enough. But we wanted to keep it open as long as possible, just to allow as many people as possible to take the survey and be able to be part of this project. And hopefully we'll be able to do it again in the future. But for now, we had about 34,000, which is an incredible turnout. Let's talk about the sample itself. So this is a few demographic measures. There's quite a few more in the report, which I'll give you a cite for in a moment. But if you look here, we show that these are the age breakdowns. It's a pretty good range of different ages. The majority were 35 to 44, but you can see it's a fairly great spread. About 10% were 18 to 24, and about 12% were 65 and older. So it's a pretty great spread. There was a larger number of males and females that take the survey. We had about 3.6% that were people that were trans or gender nonconforming. And you can see across the different number of participants by state on the other side here. So you can see Texas had 2,670. So that was quite a few for Texas, which is to be expected as one of the bigger states. But we did get enough in every state to be able to produce data for those states, which is fantastic. The report itself is available at www.secularsurvey.org, so please check it out. The entire thing there is available online. There's actually, we have the executive summary right on the website, so you don't have to download anything to view that. You can just look at the executive summary, or you can download the full PDF. The whole thing is about 60 pages. And we're going to go through some of the key results and interesting things we found. Not all of it, though. There's way too much for us to do in a PowerPoint. So please take a look at it when you have time. One interesting thing we did is at the end of the survey, we asked a couple open-ended questions about, for example, how did people first realize or come to their non-religious identity and make others aware? And also, you know, had they had any experiences that were negative or involved discrimination? And, you know, normally in these types of reports, you get about 5% of people filling in those open-ended questions. Well, we actually had about 1 in 3, which is, again, goes to show you the level of interest from the broader non-religious community in this type of data collection, because that's just a huge number. So we have well over 10,000 stories or, you know, of people and their experiences, which is amazing. And throughout the report, we put in snippets where we can to illustrate some of the things people have spoken about regarding different issues. So we tried to give a few different perspectives on different areas of the report. So I recommend checking it out, not just for the amazing statistics, but also because we put in these little snippets where we could of people's stories. And of course, this is all anonymous. The entire report was completely anonymous. We did not retain any sort of information. We don't have anything even of zip codes, so we did ask about states. So I want to be clear about that. Okay, so first of all, we asked people about their non-religious identities. So how did they identify with various non-religious labels, which we'll see on the left side here, and also what it was their primary, among those labels, their primary non-religious identity. And we see, as far as primary non-religious identities, by the vast majority chose atheist, 57%, and the one after that was humanist. So otherwise, there was a smattering of other labels, but those were by 2 the highest percentage of people's primary identity. Now, on the other side, you can see people identified usually with more than 1 label. So quite a few people identified with multiple different labels. The 2 most popular, again, were atheist and non-religious. So those were the broadest sort of appeal. And I should say that atheist, about 95% of people identified either very much or somewhat, so to some degree, as an atheist. So that was by far the most, the label that most people thought was appropriate, or at least identified with to at least some degree. So we asked questions about concealment because, you know, we did focus groups before this report. We did focus groups at the American Atheists Convention, and we interviewed, I think, about 100 people in these different focus groups, asking about their stories and their lives and their challenges to help us understand, okay, we're putting together a survey, it hasn't been done before. How do we sort of frame this? What questions do we ask? What are most important to people? Well, one thing we definitely heard many times was that people conceal their non-religious beliefs and identity from, you know, various different contexts of their lives. They might conceal from their family, they might conceal it at work, among strangers, at school, among acquaintances. So in various different areas of their lives, people don't reveal their beliefs. And so we wanted to measure that and study it. So we created what's called a scale, looking at different types of situations in life and asking people how frequently they conceal their non-religious identities. You can see those are the choices: never, rarely, sometimes, mostly, or always. And you can see in different areas of life how people concealed their different non-religious beliefs. And there's some better breakdowns in the report itself about, you know, percentages of people and how they sort of hid their beliefs in different areas. But you can see people at school, it's quite high. It's over 40%, mostly or always conceal their non-religious beliefs. And with people at work, it's about 44%, mostly or always conceal their non-religious beliefs. So across the board, this is a high level of concealment. People very frequently in our communities don't talk about their beliefs or identity, which can have a real impact. We're going to talk a little bit later about, you know, the psychological impact of stigmatization and marginalization. And so concealment is one of those things that can lead to or result in stigmatization and also lead to psychological worse outcomes. So it's important for us to understand this. I contrast this sort of with the LGBT movement a little bit, where there's been this sort of sustained campaign but understanding within the community of the importance of sort of coming out, of being out with one's identity. And over time, Harvey Milk was famous for that, saying you have to, come out. That's how we build power as a community. And so that's a real part. They have a National Coming Out Day every year, for example. So that's a real part of the culture. And I feel like, our movement does not have that to the same degree. A lot of people sort of conceal their identities in various different contexts. So we basically looked at these numbers together and created what's called a scale so that we could then sort of measure across the board. We'd have a number that we could compare in different circumstances. For example, we can look at concealment by state, or we can look at how concealment is affected when people, for example, have higher levels of discrimination or stigmatization. And so that's a really useful metric for us to follow. But this is how we got the original concealment score for individuals and for groups. We also asked about discrimination, and the way that is framed is, have you had any negative events in various areas within the past 3 years? And, so you can see the different areas we asked about over on the right-hand side. Interestingly, we saw high rates of negative events in the military and also in education and employment. And so we asked both about, whether they experienced negative events.
Hey, I'm just going to cut in, Allison, I think we lost your audio. Try unmuting. There you go.
Okay. How much did you miss there? Oh, I can't hear you now.
I would just start the point you were making back over from the beginning, because we missed about maybe 15 seconds. So we'll unmute you again.
Okay, great. I don't know why it keeps muting me. I'm not pressing mute. So this is about discrimination. So we asked about negative events people have within the past 3 years in these different areas based on their non-religious identity. So we don't just ask generally, we asked about, have you had negative events based on your non-religious identity? And you can see the areas where we saw people had the most negative events were kind of where you'd expect, with family and on social media. But when it comes to, and we don't consider those discrimination, but when it comes to things like military, education, employment, and at private businesses, we're getting more clearly into areas where we might see discrimination because of one's non-religious beliefs. And these are fairly high numbers. We asked both about, have you experienced negative events, and also do you think you've had negative events experienced because of your identity, but you're not sure? Because often people don't know if negative things they've experienced are based on their non-religious identity or not. So this sort of gives us an idea, whether they're not sure if it's based on their non-religious beliefs or not. Because sometimes you might, for example, be fired for a job, right? And you might not know, oh, it's because I just came out as an atheist there, or it might be because, you just were fired because of the economy. It's hard to know those things sometimes. So we asked about, are you not sure as well? So I'll talk a little bit about this more in detail in a moment, but this is sort of the discrimination across the board in different areas. One interesting area we saw is people faced a fairly high degree of discrimination in things like mental health and substance abuse services, in private businesses, and also especially education and employment. Okay. We also asked about stigmatization. So this is a scale developed based on negative events that do not rise to the level of discrimination, but negative events that people have in various contexts in their lives and how often they happen, so that we could understand how what a stigmatization looks like for non-religious people and communities. And so taken together, people who often have these types of experiences, they are made to feel like outsiders in communities. So taken together, these are, what we call stigmatization, when people feel like they're isolated, when they feel like they're, not part of the mainstream society, when they feel like something is wrong with them or they're being stigmatized. We know that happens for non-religious people. So this helps us assign a scale to these sort of experiences. And this was based on terrific work by Dr. Melanie Brewster, who's done much more research on this area. We took several of the questions that she had tested that sort of help us assign a scale on these issues. I should say that the first one, I've been bothered by religious symbols or texts in public places, that was not part of the scale because we found it did not align with the other questions and it was not tested in the same way. We added that because that came out of the focus groups, but it was not included in the scale. We just wanted to see what it looked like when we asked that of people. And you can see it's pretty different than the other scale items. It's much more equal in the different range bands. So that was not included. But these other areas, you can see it's a nice gradation. And so we're able to assign a scale number for stigmatization. We also asked about the psychological impact of, how often people basically are depressed or face depression, and how often they feel loneliness or isolated or lonely in different contexts. So there are two scales we used for these different questions. The likely depression scale is called the PQH2, and it's normally used as a screener to understand when someone should be further tested for depression. So it itself does not say this is depression. It's saying this person should be further tested. So we call that likely depression. And then the other scale is a three questions that we look at together, asking how often people feel isolated or lonely or like outsiders. And we're able to look at that together and basically develop a scale to understand how often people are, we call that the loneliness scale. And so by looking at these different aspects and comparing them to things like stigmatization, we're able to understand, well, do people with higher levels of stigma, for example, have worse psychological outcomes? Are they more likely to be depressed? Are they more likely to be lonely? So we're able to talk about, when people face higher levels of discrimination and such, how does it affect their psychological outcomes? Also, we looked at family rejection. So how often people feel that their families are somewhat or very unsupportive. We asked this for both people that are currently under age 25 about their families currently, and also people that are over 25 but retrospective. So when they were under 25, did they have these encounters? Were their families very supportive, somewhat unsupportive, or were they supportive? And so this is also important to know. Only people that are their families are actually aware that they're non-religious and their non-religious beliefs. So if you are under 25 and your family doesn't know that you're non-religious, then we did not mark for family rejection. But you see here that about 37% said that their families were somewhat or very unsupportive, which is a fairly high number. It's more than 1 in 3 non-religious people said that their families were somewhat or unsupportive of their religious beliefs or non-religious identity when they were under 25. And this has a really significant impact, we found, on both depression and also on educational attainment. For people with very unsupportive parents, we found that they were 71% more likely than those with supportive parents to screen positive for depression. So they had a 71% higher risk for things like depression. And we also found an impact, for example, on how likely people are to finish a college education. If they're less likely if they have very unsupportive parents, and how likely they are to go on to complete higher education and even postgraduate education. They're much more likely if they have very supportive parents. So that definitely makes an impact. And we can see, for public health purposes, and when we're reporting on these statistics, we want to not only show like what the issues are, but we want to also show, okay, what impact does this have on the actual population? How does it affect their health outcomes? And that's why we asked about psychological impact. How does it affect their educational outcomes? And that's why we asked about, these educational impacts, so that we can make cases in different areas of life, or for example, in school, about why we should adjust programs to make sure that these populations are included. So when we're asking for public health changes, it's important to ask not just about the situation itself, but to show the impact that affects health and education and other areas on the population that we're talking about. One thing we found that I thought was incredibly interesting, and probably the biggest takeaway from the report, was that we found that there's amazingly large differences in communities that are very non-religious versus very religious. And so I'll show you about how we asked that question in a moment. But we found remarkably significant differences in places that are very religious versus very non-religious. And that's not surprising to me. I grew up in New Jersey, and I currently live in Washington, D.C., both very sort of cosmopolitan areas that are not very religious, right? So I haven't lived in an area that's very religious in my life. However, the stories we hear from places that are very religious are significantly different from places like New Jersey and Washington, D.C. Non-religious people have a very different experience of life in places like Alabama and Mississippi, for example, and I'm sure in Texas as well, I'm sure it depends where you are in Texas, of course, but based on the communities that they live in. And so I'll show you what these differences actually look like and how it affects people's lives. But we're able to measure that in a real way and talk about it statistically in ways we couldn't do so before. And I think this is really important because those of us who live in areas where being non-religious is really not a big deal, like in DC, like no one cares, right? I say the vast majority of people I know in DC are non-religious. But it helps those people understand what's actually occurring in different areas of the country and what it looks like and how people's lives are. And I think that's really significant. So to understand this, we asked participants how religious their community is. And so this is the breakdown. About 4.5% of people said not at all religious, and about a third of people, almost a third, said their communities were very religious. You can see the breakdown right there. And so to rank different areas of the country, we asked what percentage of respondents said that their communities were very religious. And so you can see the most religious, the highest of percentage of places where people said their communities were very religious sort of breaks down in the deep purple, the dark purple. And below that, we see the communities where about 25 to maybe about 50% of people say their communities were very religious. And you can see Texas falls in that second category. I actually looked it up previously. And let's see here, what was the breakdown for Texas? Of course, I didn't write it down. It was just under that 47.9%. It was like 46%. So it was at the very edge of the very religious category. So these states are broken into quartiles so that there's about a quarter of the states in each of the categories. So you can see what the differences are. So I have the stats specifically for Texas in a moment, but I will show you those. And I think it was about 46%. So it was just under that line. But these are sort of what you'd expect if you were to if I were just ask a random person, hey, what are the most religious areas of the country? It'd probably give you a map sort of similar to this, right? And you can see it's both the South and also the Mountain West, Idaho and Utah, where communities, people said that their communities were very religious. And we also measured stigma across the different states. So we compared the percentage of people saying their communities were very religious with the stigmatization scale that I showed you earlier. So we're able to sort of measure by state what it looks like. And you can see there's a very clear and obvious relationship that as participants say their communities are very religious, the percentage, the stigmatization of those places is also higher. So the ones with the most religious communities and the most stigmatization are Utah and Mississippi. And so you can see Texas is about in the middle here with about, somewhere in between on both categories. On the right side, we, like the previous map, we broke down into quartiles, or quarter of the states each. Places where had a high degree of stigma, a medium degree of stigma, a low stigma, or some stigma. So basically we looked at the constituents and broke them down by state. So the highest quarter states are in dark purple, the highest level of stigmatization, and so on down the list. So those with least stigmatization, the quarter with the lowest stigmatization, were in the lightest colors in California and Washington and basically New England. So this aligns pretty closely with that other map I just showed you as well. Places where there's higher level of community religiosity, we also are seeing a higher level of stigmatization. So I want to give you some specific stats around Texas. We had about, oops, I don't have that chart. We had about 2,670 participants in Texas, and the percentage of people that said they live in very religious communities was about 46.19%, which puts you at the very edge, a higher edge of the second quartile. The concealment score, so how often people conceal their non-religious identity, was about 3.101%, which is slightly higher than the average. So it's not incredibly higher, but it is slightly higher than the average. I don't have these stats in here, but we also asked about disclosure. How often you reveal your non-religious identity to other groups in various different contexts of your life. And the disclosure scale was a little bit lower than the average. So that's, people are slightly less likely to reveal that they are non-religious in Texas. And lastly, we asked about stigma, and you can see it's about 2.3 as opposed to the average, which is at 2.16. So there's higher level of stigma overall than other states. It's not the highest category, but it is higher than other states. You can see it falls in that second category in terms of a median level of stigma compared to some other states. And again, this is overall. Texas is a very big state, and communities differ quite a lot in Texas. So this doesn't say that some people, everything's great. Some people have good experiences and some people have bad experiences. We had 2,670 people. So all we can do is take an average and show you what the mean looks like for the state. So one thing we found amazing was that in places that have a higher number, places that people identified as being very religious. So when you ask people, is your community very religious or is it not at all religious? People that say their communities are very religious, we saw a marked increase in the amount of discrimination. This was all across the board in different areas of life, but we've pulled out a few just to show you what it looks like. Here in education, for example, we found that in places that were very religious, they had about 2.5 times the amount of people saying that they faced negative events and discrimination in education compared to places that were not at all or a little bit religious. And you can see somewhat religious places fell somewhere in between those two, but it was a pretty big jump going to very religious communities. And these are very religious communities can be in different states. So like, for example, Texas has people in very religious communities, Alabama does. So it really does differ by state. So as I said before, about 46% of people in Texas said they lived in very religious communities. So just to give you an idea of what that looks like. So people who said that they're in the higher 46%, they have a heightened rate of discrimination in education. The same for public service, which is, for example, poll work, voting, all those types of public sort of services. Employment is the same. So for example, people who have had a higher level, about 3 times higher rate of discrimination in areas like employment. And also when receiving services from private businesses, going to the bank or going to dinner, things like that. So any type of private business. And people said that they faced about 2 times higher rate of discrimination in those circumstances. So this is a really significant jump, and it's important to understand the level of difference between places that are not at all religious and very religious. We also asked about different subpopulations of non-religious people. based on the demographic results. And this is just a flavor of it. There's some more in the report, but we also are going to be presenting entire papers based on like new articles based on the data on these different subpopulations so that we can more deeply delve into the differences and disparities. So right now, this is just an overview. I want to make that clear, and there's some additional numbers in the report, but we really feel a need to dive into these in greater detail. And so we're going to be doing that over the course of the next year. So start off, Black participants reported that they were half as likely as other participants to have supportive parents, which is pretty significant. And they were about 3 times as likely to be physically assaulted because of their non-religious identity. Now, I didn't talk previously about things like physical assault or property damage. We did ask about certain types of, or like, the certain types of criminal activities. The numbers overall were very small, so it wasn't really worth reporting. They're in the reports, you can read them there. But what is interesting is that when we find a marked increase among certain subpopulations, that's pretty significant. So that's why I'm reporting that specifically here. And among Black participants, it was much higher. Also, I didn't report this in the earlier, so I just want to give you a flavor. We asked people, what religion, if any, were you raised in, right? And so we can identify if people were ex-Catholic or ex-Protestant, or ex-Muslim, or ex-Buddhist, etc. And we found that ex-Muslim people had significantly higher rates of different negative incidents compared to the other groups. And the vast majority of people were ex-Protestant or ex-Catholic. And about 14% of people were raised in non-religious households. So about 14%, and you can see the actual stats in the report itself. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you to check it out. But there's this stereotype, I think, sometimes that, non-religious people are raised in either extremely strictly religious households or they're raised in non-religious households. And neither of those is exactly true. Only about 14% were raised in non-religious households. And we also asked about religious strictness. I don't have the numbers here, but if you're interested in that, you can check that out in the report. When it comes to ex-Muslims, we found that they were twice as likely to experience negative interactions with police and with court systems than the other populations. Also, among non-religious service members and veterans, we found out that about half had negative experiences during their service. So that was among the highest rates of discrimination and negative events in any one particular area. We had quite a few stories saying that the one place in their lives they ever had this type of discrimination was in the armed services. And then young people, we found some interesting disparities, were about 5 times as likely to be physically assaulted because of their non-religious identities in other populations, and about 3 times as likely to report being likely depressed. We're going to, the first report, subpopulation report we're hoping to put out will be on young people. So we're hoping to do that before the end of the year, currently working on it. And so that will go into quite a bit of additional detail about this population because there's a lot to say between things like, family rejection, discrimination areas like school, and these stats we're seeing, there's a lot to talk about. And so that will be hopefully out. Our goal was to get it out before the beginning of the school year, but we'll see how that goes. So that's one of the things we're working on for the future. We asked participants about their policy priorities. So we asked generally about what sorts of policy priorities are important to them. And we also asked, okay, of those, which are your top 3 key policy priorities? So we can have an understanding of what it is the community is in favor of for and what they want us as secular groups to be doing on their behalf. So I should say the 3 key priority policy items are, the question was framed around, what do you want groups, national groups representing secular communities to be focused on at the national level? And so the top 3 areas, and this is by far the highest percent, more than 50% of people said that their highest priority area was maintaining secular public schools. So that was something that was really interesting and very important to a lot of folks. Also, number 2 was opposing religious exemptions that allow for discrimination. And the third was access to abortion and contraception. So those were the top 3 issues. And you can see after that, there's sort of decreases to a number of other important issues, such as inappropriate political activity by churches. The Johnson Amendment is what we're sort of framing there. Things like LGBT equality, protecting youth from religion-based harm. And at the bottom of the list is opposing religious displays on public property. Now, there's this another stereotype about non-religious people that's all we care about. We just care about like crosses on public property and nothing else. And that we're always up in arms about that. And that's, as this study shows, really a stereotype that was by far the least important thing in people's minds. And this is what they want us national groups like American Atheists to be working on. So that was at the lowest of the list, which I found really interesting. People care a lot about the broader issues and want us to be engaged on things that go a little bit beyond what the traditional understanding of church-state activism, for example, looks like. They want not just maintaining secular public schools, but also things like access to abortion and contraception are really important to folks, and they want us to be looking into it. Also, climate change got really high, 35%. So that was also another area that people felt really significantly about. So I find this interesting, and I think it's helpful for as we think about the work we're going to be doing moving forward in different areas. We also asked about people's voting and how often they vote. So first of all, almost 95% of people said they were registered to vote, which is huge. That's a very high rate, percentage of voting. And about 87% of people said they voted in 2016, or they nearly or always vote. And you can see the breakdowns individually by state there. Texas is a bit lower than many. I think it fell in the lowest category of only about 79% had voted in, I think this is the stats around voting in 2016. So only about 79%. So they're a little bit lower than the average. So there's still some work to do in Texas, but overall it's fairly high. And there's a stereotype. If you look at, for example, the work by PRI and Pew, they say that religiously unaffiliated people are much less likely to vote than the general population. However, as I said earlier, this is not a survey of religiously unaffiliated people. This is a survey of people who actively identify with one or more non-religious labels. So this is a survey of non-religious people. It's a little bit different. So I think sometimes that focus on non-religious people, it sort of obscures the data about our community in some ways. And that's why it's important for us to do this work and delve more deeply into our communities, because we have these important differences, and it shows how politically active our communities are. I mean, this is a very high rate of engagement. And this is also really important because now we can go to lawmakers and say, hey, we vote quite often. We're watching what you're doing. These are our policy priorities, and we are paying attention, and we vote at very high rates. So you should keep our community in mind for the future and for, care about our activism. Because far too often, without these sorts of stats, we're invisible. People don't recognize that, oh, I have non-religious people living in my district. So this helps show where we live and what we care about, which I think is going to be very useful for the future. And lastly, we asked about local group engagement. And so this is two separate charts, just to be clear. I'll go through them both. The top one, we asked people, have they participated in various activities at the local level? Well, first of all, I should say about 22% of people said they were involved with their local community group, whatever it might be. About, maybe it's a free thought group or a secular group or, the local Oasis group. So about 22%, which is about 1 in 5. And that's a very high degree of engagement. So it's fantastic. Obviously, we want that to be even higher, but that is, a fairly high degree. And about, I'm not sure the percentages vary for the national groups, but about 1 in 10, they were involved with American Atheists. And I think 14% for FFRF, and it was lower after that. So we also asked about, have people participated in various different types of activities with local groups? For example, social opportunities, debate, educational opportunities, volunteer advocacy. And you can see the percentages here. Most people are most likely to have participated in social opportunities. But we also asked about, are they interested in doing such? I would consider this in category 2, by the way, debates and lectures. So if you're ever asked to get to take this again, you can check that off. But you see people are, there's a fairly high rate of interest in different areas. We saw the most interest for resources with people with children. So we saw the lowest rates of people actually having those and the most interest in that people having those in the future. So that's one thing we hear quite often is that, I really want to go participate in more events with local groups, but I need to bring my kids along and they don't have anything to do. And so that's something to keep in mind as we're doing more local group work in the future and providing resources is we really need to think about this area if we really want to empower and energize our local work. So I thought this was very interesting, and I hope it can be a useful thing to think about for local organizations. But also interestingly, we found that involvement with organized secularism, whether at the national or local level, is an important protective factor that reduces likely depression. So these numbers here at the bottom are for percentage reduced likely depression. And so membership in a national organization, and we found that people are about a third less likely to be depressed, to have better psychological outcomes. And the same is true for participating in at least one secular activity, and about one quarter less likely to be likely depression if they were a local group member. So you can see the breakdown and differences there. So being involved with your local groups and participating in them at the national and local level is actually an important factor to help combat likely depression, isolation, and loneliness. And so that's something, when we were doing our focus groups, what reason we asked about this is because many people sort of complained about, or not complained, but they reported saying that they felt isolated or lonely because of their identity, and that sometimes they were seen as outsiders. And so we had to ask these questions so that we had an understanding of what this looks like and what sort of leads to those outcomes and how we can prevent them. And I think that this data, I hope it's incredibly useful in the future. It sort of shows us what we're doing right and what we can do to improve our communities. So just to talk briefly about what's coming next. Researchers, as I mentioned before, we're going to be developing, I didn't mention this, we're going to be making this data available to researchers and to partner organizations. Our goal is to, it's not just a survey for American Atheists, it's a survey for the entire secular movement. That's how we really want to think about this. And so we want to make sure the data is available. So I'm currently in negotiations with the University of Michigan around this. Once we get it all uploaded, and they have to develop some sort of access protocols for making sure that not just some random person gets it, but for people that are actually qualified to take it and do research on it. But that's currently underway, and then it will be available more broadly. We're also going to be jointly creating with other national organizations briefs on populations, which I mentioned earlier, for example, non-religious young people. And then finally, we're going to be providing additional webinars on how to use this data in different areas, like how do I use this data for advocacy? How do I, as a local group, how do we use it to better shape our programs? Or how do we use it to, engage in, I'm sort of blanking, but advocacy and community outreach are two important ways. I'm sure they'll have others. Maybe you'll have some questions about some. So how you can get involved? Well, first of all, please visit secularsurvey.org and download the report and take a look at it. We actually have an action alert set up right there on the page. It's super easy, but you can send the report to your lawmakers. And the reason to do that is it helps them understand our community better if they take the time to read it, hopefully. And also it shows them that they have constituents who are non-religious in their districts. We get that a lot from lawmakers, like, oh, we're all Christians here. We don't have non-religious people. Well, that's BS. They do have non-religious people, and help them understand that we vote and we have priorities that they should care about. So it's very straightforward. You just have to fill out the form and it goes to all of your state and federal officials, state and federal lawmakers. You can also help raise awareness by tweeting about the report. We have a few hashtags there. And lastly, this report and this research was only made possible, it was funded entirely by donors. And so if you'd like to support this work, we have a donation link right on the site. So we hope to do more of it in the future. I'm already talking about some of the reports we're going to be doing. And hopefully down the road, we'll be able to do this report again, maybe based on, when you do something like this, you always learn from your experiences. So we can do an even better version of it. Although I think this version provides a tremendous amount of data that we never had before as a community, which is really critical. And that is my entire presentation. So thank you so much for giving me time. And I think we're going to take a break now for breakout groups, and then we're going to do Q&A.
Thank you so much, Allison. Excellent presentation and a lot of great comments were coming in both on our Facebook and in the Zoom chat here. As Allison said, we are going to take a 10-minute break. All right, everybody, welcome back. We're going to take some time now for a little bit of Q&A with Allison after the talk. And so we have some questions here in our Zoom chat. This is also a time if you want to ask some questions over on the Facebook Live or in the Zoom chat, you can do that here. But the first question we have, Allison, is a question regarding the government collecting religious data. Do you like the idea of the government collecting religious data?
That is a complicated question. I cannot give a yes or no for that question. So in some ways, yes. So if the government were to collect religious data, it has to do so in a way that's sensitive and also confidential. All right, can you hear me? I'm sorry, I was, okay. And so, you know, there's actually been a push under this administration to collect more religious data in different sort of strange areas. Like they actually have this survey that they've been promoting or trying to create to actually support abstinence-only education. And so they basically, as part of this, they ask, what are your religious beliefs, and would you characterize yourself as very conservative? And then do your religious beliefs sort of compel you to abstain from sexual activity? Those sorts of things, so that they can build the case that we should have religious sex ed or abstinence sex ed in schools. So we don't want it used in that way. Like if it's going to be collected, it needs to be collected in a way that's impartial and fair and not used to sort of advance a religious agenda. And so, you know, it's a complicated question. I'll just leave it at that. Right now, we're not really in a place to move forward with it, particularly because of this 1972 law about the census. Otherwise, the census seems like it'd be sort of an ideal place because it's depersonalized, it's something we can get broad categories across different groups. So I think that would be sort of an ideal place. But I think we as a community will need to discuss this further and try to figure out where would be the best places for us to collect data. And we can't just give a universal yes or no, because there's too much problems with potential mischief. Like, let me give you another example. There's data collection in schools around bullying and harassment, right? And so what if they collect data in a way from young people that's not sensitive, and then it's used to ostracize those young people or not take their concerns seriously, or like out them to the rest of the community or their parents? Or, you know, you can imagine all sorts of confidentiality issues that can arise. So we have to really be considered. And, you know, we're trying to walk that line when we make suggestions to the government on these issues.
Another question, Allison, came up. Do you study cross-demographic groups? And somebody had mentioned like an intersection of somebody that was pansexual and atheist. Do you do any of that type of stuff?
We did. We asked about LGBTQ status and also gender identity. We actually found that about a quarter of folks who took the survey were LGBTQ identified. It was about 23%. About 3.6% were trans or gender nonconforming. And then there's a breakdown right in the demographics page 14 of the report, that shows different sort of categories. Bisexual was about 11.3%, pansexual was about 4.2%. So we asked with quite a degree of specificity. And there was some breakdown by, we saw some disparities among LGBTQ people in the report, and those are detailed in the subpopulation part. I'll see if I can pull that up quickly. I don't have that at the top of mind, but like I said, we're going to be doing different breakdowns in future reports. So I'm not sure if we're going to be doing one on LGBTQ people or not at this stage. We found that LGBTQ participants had a higher rate of family rejection than non-LGBTQ participants, which is something you'd expect because, of course, we see unfortunate levels of family rejection among LGBTQ people already. So if you compound that, then there's even a higher rate, unfortunately. But there are a few other interesting results there as well.
Somebody had asked just about an estimate of the size of the non-religious population, if there was any way to do that.
There's no way to do that from this research. Just to be clear, this is not a population survey. This is a convenience sample. So we can't speak to the broader community. However, I would point you to research done by Pew. I pointed to those numbers before, and they don't ask about they don't set up the categories in the same way we do. So if you look at the two labels, I guess that would fall somewhere into our report, which are atheist and agnostic, it's about 9% of the population of the United States. However, like if we were to add humanist and free thinker and other categories, then that might change. So I can't really, although we did find about 95% of people identified as atheists to at least some degree, right? So maybe we are capturing that in that 9%. So there's no like direct answer to that. Except, I think we can use 9% as like a good estimate for now because it's the best we have.
There's some discussion in a breakout room. Somebody had said they'd like to ask sort of the larger public, and I'll pose this to you, Alison. They've run into trouble lately with psychological help in terms of getting told you have to believe in something or you can never be happy or sane. So what is the, and what are the potential resources for people? You obviously talked about some of the psychological impacts in the survey in those cases.
Absolutely. There are, well, let me just go to that page here. So we saw high rates, unfortunately, of discrimination in areas both with mental health services and also substance abuse. I think it was about 17.7% in mental health services and about 15% in substance abuse services. And those are people who had reached out, and for example, that's not the entire group. That's people who had actively sought out those types of services. Just to be clear. And we also have several snippets of stories of people saying those exact things. Like when they reached out for help, they were told, "Oh, you have to be religious, and that's why you're depressed," or things like that. And unfortunately, that happens all too often, especially in very religious areas, which is really sad and harmful. Now, there are several different groups that can help with that. I know that, for example, the Secular Therapist Project exists, and that's sort of, they can help identify folks that might be suitable for secular people seeking therapy. There's also, for those seeking, for example, recovery services or substance abuse services, there's groups like Smart Recovery and LifeRing, which offer, they're not sort of, when I say AA, I don't mean us, I mean Alcoholics Anonymous. They're not affiliated with them. So it's not as sort of religion focused. It's much more about, secular sorts of recovery. So understanding patterns and addressing them, as opposed to what's it called, cognitive behavioral therapy, as opposed to sort of the religious approach. So those exist, and they have groups all across the country, including in Texas. And I'd recommend you take a look at them if you're interested. It's Smart Recovery is what it's called. So, no one should have to be subject to, I don't know, I'd almost call that misconduct or abuse if you go in for help for mental health care and they sort of berate you for not being religious enough. But, no one should have to deal with that. And I don't know, I think that's something that local groups can help with as well, to identify good therapists and maybe provide referrals to each other.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that is surprisingly sometimes something you run into in Texas. You go to a counseling place and there's kind of an underlying belief, that you have to believe in something. No wonder you're so miserable, you don't believe in anything. Okay.
And it's not true. I mean,
right, exactly, yeah.
People are connected when they're part of these communities that, the rates for depression and loneliness decrease rapidly. Like people sometimes have depression and loneliness because they're disconnected, because they're stigmatized, right? Because they face discrimination. And if they become more connected to groups, then that goes down. And we have just all these quotes from people saying that exact thing in these stories, which we provide a number of, like how important it is for people to have these local support groups and to have these communities, especially in very religious areas. So I think the work you all do is incredibly important. And thank you, because, it affects a lot of people's lives in a very positive way.
So we've got a question here about the report in general. Hunter asks, how would one send this report to our representatives?
Yes, that's a great question. So right on secularsurvey.org, www.secularsurvey.org/act, right? There is an action alert set up. So you just have to enter your information. Based on your address, it will identify your lawmakers, and you just have to click send, and it will send, a link. It has a little letter there talking about the report, including a link to the report. So that's probably the easiest way to send it. Or if you want to do it more manually, you could look up your lawmakers and send them a PDF. But this way is probably a lot easier for you, so you don't have to do all that extra work. So just go ahead enter your information. It will tell you who your lawmakers are, and you can adjust the letter if you want to, too. If you want to say something personal, you can certainly do so.
This is an interesting question. How many people grew up non-religious versus left a religion?
Yes, we talked about that a little bit. So on page 20 of the report, we see that people that were raised in a non-religious household was about 14.3%. So that means about 86% grew up in some form of religious household. Now, those vary quite a lot. So we asked, okay, for those of you who grew up in religious households, how strict was your religious upbringing? And there's another chart on page 21 that shows, we actually broke it out by sort of religious faith, and then how strict was their upbringing. We found that, for example, the strictest people that had the highest rates of strict upbringing was people who are Catholic, Protestant, and Muslim.
Fascinating. Well, listen, all of the information you presented this morning was fascinating. Thanks everybody for your questions. And let's thank Alison one more time. There is applause going on. We can't hear it because it's a virtual meeting, but there are jazz hands and claps going on. And so thank you again, Alison, for joining us and presenting this data.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And if anyone has any questions for me, my email was included in the slides. Feel free to reach out. We're really excited about this data, and we want to make all the use of it we can. So thank you all.
And a special thank you to the American Atheists for helping us this morning. So Alison is here. I should also mention Samantha McGuire is in the meeting, the National Field Director for the American Atheists, as well as Will Judy, the Assistant State Director for the Houston area for the American Atheists. And so we're glad to have them here. And of course, we want to thank everybody that made this morning possible, all of our co-hosts. So if you enjoyed sort of the vibe of this morning and getting up on a Sunday morning, Galveston Bay Oasis and Houston Oasis are communities here in the Houston area that you can join that meet every Sunday at 10:30 and sort of do a similar format like this. If you don't like getting up on Sunday morning, because that's one of the reasons you left religion, the Humanists of Houston, I should mention, have a monthly meeting where they also get together and have some excellent talks. Houston Atheists, when you guys were doing your breakout rooms, if you like that smaller connection, some of those group meetings, the Houston Atheists are a good source for you. And if you're a college student, you want to check out Secular Student Alliance at the University of Houston. We're going to post some links for all of those groups with some resources and opportunities to get involved in the Zoom chat, as well as in the Facebook chat as well. But one more thing we'd like to do before we sign off this morning is welcome back the excellent musician that we started with for one more song. Everybody, please welcome back, Sara Van Buskirk.
I did 4 shots this morning before I travel. You know me, I can't hold my own, so I'm laying it down when I come home. Remember that I was young. Hey, I was pure like an angel when you told me you loved me. Well, on down I fell. I couldn't see. My heart, it was blind. So laying it down for my peace of mind. Girl, you drive my heart crazy, wild like a fire. It's a fine line of balance all along that wire. But you're just like me, we both feel all alone. So I just give you scrambling, and I have been that loser. That road has left my eggs scrambling, fried and a boozer. But now I can see this life is not my own. So I'll just lay down, 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 while I stay home.
Sara Van Buskirk, thank you, Sara, and thank you everybody for joining this special event. I should mention there is going to be a replay of this available on Facebook as well as YouTube, so share it with your friends if you enjoyed it this morning. We hope to see everybody back at some point in the future for another one of these. Thanks everybody for joining, and we'll see you soon. Take care.